looks like we have the last of the stragglers coming in, and maybe we should get started. So this is a panel on the future of content and its containers, and I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm Tom Beyer. Let's see if I can actually work this thing. There we go. My name's Tom Beyer. I'm the director of platform services at Sheridan Pub Factory. Still getting used to that. But that translates into, I'm basically the person that worries about the Pub Factory platform and the strategy for it moving forward. And Pub Factory is a white label scholarly publishing platform that currently is hosting about 1,400 journals and about 400,000 books across a variety of publishers and imprints. So I thought, and as the moderator of this panel, I thought I would just try to give a little bit of context to what it is that we're talking about, and also sort of try to sort of position how our panelists are sort of fit into the whole discussion. So the sort of fundamental question is, what do we mean by containers, and how have they evolved as we've sort of been in this online world? In the print world, we had containers were pretty obvious. They were really the package that you received the content in. So every month you got your journal subscription, that issue, where you went down to the bookstore and bought a book, and that package, and it's evolved over hundreds of years, and really it's a really actually very finely tuned thing. But in addition to sort of the physical package, there's also the context of that container, the sort of the reputation and of the publisher or of the journal, and sort of a signal of value. So we've been doing this online thing for quite a long time now, and it's sort of interesting to sort of look at what's happened to those containers in the online world, and how are they evolving? So we're going to try to sort of look at that from a variety of different perspectives, and sort of examine what's going on and where we think things are going in the future. So sort of one of the sort of obvious things that a lot of people talk about is this idea of container collapse, where given the way researchers work, where you're doing searches in discovery services or in search engines outside of any sort of publisher package or site or platform, and then dipping into individual articles and back out again. There's this sort of idea that the container has really sort of in a sense gone away, but there's still a lot of sort of interesting value there. In terms of that sort of secondary thing in the print world of the sort of context and value of the content. What does the sort of the publishing imprint, the journal name bring to the user in terms of a signal of value for the content? But it's also interesting that that's sort of the sort of traditional sort of thing that we think about a lot in terms of the sort of container collapse. But another thing that's sort of happening is that there's also kind of a container expansion, in the sense that in books there's this sort of trend for book collections and in journals as well, where you get these sort of journal collections. So depending on how you're sort of looking at it, there's a variety of different ways in which the containers are both sort of going away or expanding. And we'll sort of dive into some of those details. And Ove Kohler from Brill, I think we'll really sort of delve into some of those details, in the sense of, from a big academic publisher with a big broad set of content, how do you bring all that content online in a way that makes sense, across this sort of, and how do you provide the necessary context for your users for the content they're providing, that Brill is providing. And something else that, just sort of to step back, I think it's always useful, because we get so sort of focused into the scholarly world, to look at trends in the more sort of mainstream online world. music is sort of a canonical example of real container collapse. When music went online, we really sort of lost the idea of CDs and albums and things, and where the individual song really became important, especially in popular music. And now even to the point where ownership has sort of gone away, where streaming services are really taking over. But I'm a little wary about sort of taking too much from the world of music as a sort of guide for how scholarly communications might go, because it's such a different world. But if we look at something a little bit closer to home, news, for instance, I know that in my consumption of news and in my peers that I've talked to, there's been a real evolution over time of how we consume news. Originally I would go to news sites. It was very equivalent to sort of opening the newspaper, or you'd go to the New York Times or whatever your favorite news site was. And then over time that sort of evolved to sort of personal aggregation services. So something like Flipbook was a favorite of mine. And to the point where now the aggregation services are really the social media networks or the news systems, like Apple News, where, and those essentially become the containers for that content, but they're coming from publishers. So, and it turns out that there's still a sort of an important aspect that the publishers are providing in terms of sort of a signal of value. So when I'm going through my Apple News stream, I really look for that source for where the headline is coming from to sort of give me a signal about whether or not I really do want to click through and read the item. And what's interesting with social networks is that there's sort of a number of sources that are signaling that kind of value, that kind of context. Both the source, the publishing source, but also who provided the link online, and what is your relation to that person. That sends a really strong signal about what you're thinking, how you interpret the headline of the content that they've posted. And in the last year or two, there's sort of been another sort of big wave in the mainstream world of the rise of Alexa and the Amazon Echo, and how and that sort of adds a whole new sort of layer and sort of distance from the content, in the sense of how do you provide those kinds of secondary signals, those value signals, those context signals in an audio world, so I think looking at what's happening in mainstream media is kind of interesting, because is this really going to happen in the scholarly world? And I think to a certain extent it already is. Researchers are using alerting services, and they're using social networks. And so, a lot of the sort of, even the sort of reading and initial sort of discovery of content is happening outside of the publisher, context of the publisher platform, and how are they getting the sort of necessary context and value, deciding what's interesting content to them. And Tara Cataldo from the University of Florida has got a really interesting, they're sort of in the middle of a long study, and she's got some really interesting research on exactly this sort of thing. It's sort of, how do students and researchers get that value, and it's kind of eye-opening. So I think that'll be a really interesting aspect of the panel. And when we actually think about what do we mean by the containers themselves, and what happens to, actually, did I go forward or did I go backwards? Yeah, so if we look at, what kinds of containers are really important in the online world, it's obvious with articles that I think over time we're seeing a real sort of bulking up of the article as a container in its own right. We're getting multiple versions, we're adding, multiple kinds of content, media, audio, video, supplementary material, data sets are all sort of packaged in that article sort of framework. But what's interesting is how, in some senses, the sort of structure of the article has changed relatively little. There's been sort of every few years this talk of the article of the future. But in fact, the sort of structure of the article hasn't changed a lot. But I do think there's this sort of drift towards a bigger and bigger article, since there really aren't the same kind of size constraints in the online world that there are in the print world. Books are interesting because I think books are quite a diverse kind of content, depending on the kind of books they are. They're really sort of evolving in different ways. We do quite a different variety of books on the Pub Factory platform, and some have really become like journals. They're moving to a continuous publication model where individual chapters are being updated constantly, and the business models are mostly subscription-based. And the big reference works are really sort of becoming databases. They're sort of shedding their print antecedents entirely. I mean, for instance, the OED, a couple of years ago, announced that they were simply never going to do a new print edition of the dictionary, whereas they're constantly updating it online. But the one kind of book that has really resisted and really held on to the book itself as an important container are those singularly authored monographs. And I think that it's maybe also part of why ebooks have perhaps not been as successful as people accept, have sort of not really taken off online, is that providing that sort of multiple chapter, the context of the book in an online setting, which really, given the sort of singular nature of the screen, really sort of privileges the chunk level items. Doing a good job of providing a real context within the book. It's actually a surprisingly hard interface challenge online. So, it would be interesting to see how that evolves. And as I mentioned earlier, the other thing that's happening is that collections are, this idea of collections are really growing, both in the journal world and the book world, but also across content types and also across publishers. So that to the point where, the big book aggregators, some of them provide their own value. They provide a sort of a value signal in and of themselves. Something like Project Muse, is themselves as a curated collection providing a certain context for all the books within that collection. And Wil Switzer from AAAS, is really going to sort of dive into some of the complexities and details of how they see these containers evolving in the context of AAAS and really sort of to the extent where they're sort of going beyond that. And there's some really interesting stuff that he has to share as well. And the one last thing I just wanted to end on is the other thing that I think is an interesting aspect of being online is the extent to which, to the degree to which containers can become silos. We're also sort of breaking down those barriers through the use of cross-linking. And we've all been sort of really focused on references and citations for a long time. But I think just further cross-linking will happen and be increasingly important. It's really always been surprising to me as a platform developer how hard it is for the publishers to provide us all of their content with really robust cross-linking across all of the publisher content. It's just, and they've often looked to us to try to provide sort of technical band-aids to that problem. But those kinds of links, both within the publisher's corpus, but also across the whole scholarly landscape, I think is going to be a sort of a defining characteristic and an important aspect of content online, and really sort of provides a serious amount of value. And I think one of the interesting things that does is it means that any piece of content actually will end up living in multiple containers at once, and those different containers will provide that context and value, and different context and value for different users depending on the aggregations and the way that the content is sort of living together. So just a few thoughts to sort of spark your mind and to give some context to our panelists. What we're going to do is they're each going to have a short presentation, and then we should have ample time for questions from you and questions amongst ourselves as well. We've been sort of talking amongst ourselves quite a bit for the last week or two in getting ready for this. So please do ask questions. We really want this to be a dialogue and to make it as interesting as possible. Thank you. And now for Ove.
Okay, thanks Tom for the introduction. I might risk repeating some of the things that you said now. which make them just more true. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ove from Brill, and I will basically make 2 points. I can already maybe stop after the 2 points, but I will elaborate a little bit on them. I would argue that I believe in the future of containers and also of the traditional containers in spite of all the things that are evolving around them. And secondly, because containers are useful. They are useful as long as they don't become silos. We talked about silos, but we have to make use of the fact that they provide structure. And and I'll try to make that point. So first, a little bit about Brill, my company that I work for. The company was founded 1683 in the Netherlands, and here you see the canal where the company was located for many, many years before we moved outside the city. Next to that, we now have offices in Boston, yes, and in Germany also, in Singapore. We're a leading publisher in selected areas of the humanities and international law. And yeah, indeed, we publish a broad range of publication types, content containers, if you wish. Next to 270 journals, we still publish a lot of books, which is due to the fields that we are active in. And I should say books contribute, to just put things in perspective, 2/3 of our revenue. And more than half of those books comes from print. So the print container is also still quite important, but you could also argue the other way around. Almost half of it now comes from online. So that's also quite amazing in our field. So I'm operations director at Brill, and one task of my department is to manage the distribution of the data and of the products in print and online. And I say products, which is a commercial term, but from the perspective of our stakeholders, buyers, readers, authors, these products are obviously publication outlets or content containers. And let's start by having a closer look at what those are and to define them. The classical examples are journals, monographs, encyclopedia, dictionaries, and so on and so forth. And each of these content type serves a different purpose for the author or for the reader. And yet they all have one thing in common. They were all created in the print age. And they were created in the print age for a reason, because they allowed the transfer of knowledge in the form of a printed container, of a printed product. I will say a little bit more on the next slide. But then the amazing thing is that they still sustain in the digital age, although technology would allow to decompose them, and it does, but they still have a role. And I will talk about that on the next slide. Actually, when we talked as a panel before, and when I thought about this a little bit more, I came up with 4 functions of content containers, which I put into a framework. So on the top, you see the 2 functions that allow facilitating the transaction, and that's from the print age to make things saleable and distributable. And you might think those are the same things, but then I thought of a suggestion that a librarian did recently at our library advisory board. He suggested, why don't you start selling your content in megabytes? So it would be saleable to say, 10 megabytes of Asian studies cost 30 euro. But is that distributable? Probably not. So these still are things which are a little bit different from each other, although they merge. They are, of course, true also with the content chunks that we know today, with journal articles, with book chapters, to a lower extent with reference works entries or dictionary entries. I mean, have you ever heard people saying, can I just buy the B from this dictionary? This is the past, the transaction side. But then the digital age allows decomposing these traditional containers either into smaller chunks, but it also allows bigger bundles in journal collections and ebook collections. And the question is whether this might make the traditional containers obsolete at some point. And my view is no, I said that before, because of the 2 reasons on the bottom. Containers give guidance by helping users to distinguish between the different types of content that they see in front of them. And containers give guidance in terms of showing people what to read and what not to read in terms of their reputation. And that's very subjective. But starting with the first one, say you Google something like about impeachment, for instance. You will treat the results differently depending on whether you find an entry in a dictionary, English, French, or whether it's a research article in a journal or a book review published in a journal, and it could be a news item. So people, our users, our librarians, continue to tell us, yeah, we just want to look for stuff. Don't make those distinctions, it's not important. But I think they say this because they internalized it to an extent they don't even realize how important it is for them that they can make those distinctions. And also a journal article lends its guidance from the fact that it's an article in a journal, and that's a very well-known concept. And once you find an article that you're looking at, you're more likely to download it, obviously, to read it when it was published in a top journal or by a top society. And that's actually the analogy with the music industry. You talked about decomposing there. Well, I mean, you still have brands in the music industry. The problem is that we don't have a Lady Gaga in publishing. So we don't have someone, we have Nobel Prize winners, but the bulk of the authors are not stars, but they base their fame on the fact that they managed to get their article in a journal. And if I'm confronted with 2 million new journal articles every year, I need to make a selection, and that is the guidance that I use. So I conclude that journals and books continue to be vital containers. And the big question is now how to organize the content and those containers in an online world. The question is particularly challenging for us, as I mentioned already, with our broad diversity of container types. And well, one tempting side could be to just say, well, one size fits it all. We built this one super duper platform. But what we would be afraid of is that the breadth of content and the distinctiveness of the containers would actually be lost. It would be a loss of value. So we decided years ago, and there are good reasons to do that, to organize our resource by content containers. As mentioned earlier, those containers serve different functions in the scholarly workflow. They answer different research questions, they're being used differently, and they also require different functionality. So as a consequence, we decided to organize our resources by container-based platforms, and since 2011 we have launched 5 of them. You see them here, and I'll mention them a little bit more on the next slide when I present you a fictitious example that could happen in the current world. Imagine I want to find more out about the history of the Islam in Europe. So I could start with Brill's platform for primary sources, which you see on the top. And then I come across a collection of digitized material from archives. And one of those collections gives access to translations of the Quran in Western languages in the 16th century. So why am I describing that? Because on such a platform, you will, as a user, want to have a functionality that allows you to search those publications based on the year of origin and not the year of publication. We, as Brill, put this collection online 2005. And that is what you would find if you would just try to find a date on the Books and Journals platform. But the Quran is from, translated Quran from 1683. And that is a functionality that we would miss if we would try to put everything on one platform, or we would make it confusing. Same with the bibliographies platform. We have bibliographies, collections of literature on specific topics, of course, one of our core topics also on Islamic studies, and also that specific content type requires special functionality. I'm sure you're all very familiar with platforms that host books and journals. So I find a work, I read it there, then I go to the ReferenceWorks platform that offers encyclopedias and commentaries, also in Islamic studies, and then they again have all these container-specific features. And last but not least, we have a platform for scholarly dictionaries, where I would expect to find the Brill's Dictionary of Quranic Usage. But interestingly, this one is on the ReferenceWorks platform. Well, we do have a dedicated platform for dictionaries, and that has a good reason, because we wanted to have it closer to the other resources that people use who go to that dictionary. And also because this dictionary happens to have a similar technical structure like an encyclopedia. On the other hand, one could argue that all dictionaries are in fact ReferenceWorks, and aren't all ReferenceWorks books. So we have ReferenceWorks on our books platform, and we also have books that are on the ReferenceWorks platform. You still follow me? In other words, there is a lot to say for organizing publications by container type, and it does indeed solve some problems, but it also creates new problems. And one of them is that the distinction between content containers is not always clear to start with. So users try to find a resource on the wrong platform. We've had that all the time. But even if the definitions are clear, there are other problems as well. Challenges with the approach that we have chosen. For instance, we assumed, well, we are not naive, but there was a certain sequence in the research workflow, which I just showed on the previous slide, but it is obvious, and we also knew that people would just be all over the place, and they go to these resources at the same time, and of course they don't just go to Brill, they don't even know the name Brill, some of them, unfortunately. They just find things and they grab them, and that's what they do. So, you know, putting them neatly in different places helped with some things, but yeah, it didn't really impress some of these researchers as well, but it created the problems that I talked about. So this is the current situation. And so the key element of our way of presenting the publications online are the 5 container-based platforms that I mentioned. Then we have a 6th platform, actually, because we also created a linking hub, brillonline.com, to search through those platforms. One challenge for us there was that there wasn't a lot of usage, even though we call it the main entry points into those platforms. So that was one of the things that we tried to address to get actually people to experience more of our stuff. This entry point should give access to all Brill Online resources, but it doesn't, because for several reasons, and good reasons, there are still a number of products which have their own platform and will continue having their own platform for licensing reasons, format reasons. So there are ReferenceWorks, you won't believe that are not on the ReferenceWorks platform. By now, we also have a subject-based platform, and again, for good reasons, because this Chinese reference library requires the support of Chinese language, well, for obvious reasons, and that's something that we needed to provide in a special environment. But it doesn't really fit into the current approach, so we had a hard time explaining how we actually organize things. Last but not least, there is our corporate homepage, brill.com, where you find company information, but also in terms of discoverability, the product catalog, including the print books, with one very unfortunate consequence. If you search stuff in your discovery service or on Google and you came across a result that was relevant from our books collection, you would find that book twice, one as an ebook and one as a print book. And we always were very excited that 50% of the referrals on our books and journals platform came from our corporate website, until we started to realize that those might have been people who ended up on the wrong platform after they found something. And then we don't even know how many got lost there. So things are going well. We have great usage. So I don't want to be too negative, because also we have thought about that a lot. These were very important steps for us to get our content online, to digitize it, to experience, to learn, to be in contact with users, with editorial boards. But there's a time when we thought we need to sort of get things to the next level, and that's when we met those guys at Pop Factory, and we came up with a slightly different approach. So that's the future situation. We plan to do the following. I hope I get the animation right. We plan to launch one big umbrella platform, which is going to be called brill.com, and that will serve several purposes. Well, I just go ahead with this. It will serve several purposes. It will also be our corporate homepage. It will include the entire metadata catalog, including the print books. But it will, of course, it will be our new books and journals platform, but also host most of our encyclopedia. And then basically you look at container types that have a similar structure partly and at least have a foreseeable, simple structure, and that can be easily put on the same place. While we continue to have and are proud to have products that don't fit into a very simple structure. Those are the products that make us special as Brill and that only we publish because they require a 10-year investment into a very special reference work that we are really experts on in our field. But this umbrella platform will then also be the hub. Remember, the hub that we currently have is not being used, but now we will greet people. Most of the usage is happening on the books and journals platform also now. We will greet people there, and that will then also the place, if people want to explore our content further, where we have already a critical mass that will then be able to find other stuff and then go to other platforms. So we believe that with this approach, we honor the differences between the containers. We give them the room that they deserve, but we stop building boundaries. And and that brings me to the conclusions that I started with, that traditional containers still have a role also in the digital age, and containers are useful as long as they don't end up being silos. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Wil Switzer. I'm the Director of Product and Custom Publishing at the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Science family of journals. And I'm going to take a different approach, and I'm going to get a little more philosophical. And I wrote kind of 4 very generic slides, which meant I could rewrite my talk as Ove talked. But I'm going to pick up with his theme that the container doesn't matter as much as long as it doesn't end up being a silo. And where I think we're headed isn't so much as changing our container or blowing up the article, but creating interoperability around the container. Because what matters is how people use the container rather than the fact that it's a chapter or a monograph or a book article. Because containers are multiple things. We talked about kind of their shape and the purpose they serve, but containers are kind of a unit of expression. More importantly, when we think about what containers mean to the authors, they're a unit of evaluation. They're how our content is distributed and consumed. And of course, it's how our content is sold. And I think a lot of those elements create some inertia that means the article isn't going anywhere. What's going to change is how our platforms treat that content, what service layers we create around it. Do we create APIs that allow essentially the valuable threads that a researcher wants to be pulled out of the container and pulled into another service, into their workflow? And I think that's what we've seen, and we have some data from science that shows that trend growing. So what I wanted to say, and this is my thesis, that our content, our articles have always been under pressure, and I'm talking almost exclusively about journal articles because that's where I have experience. And for a lot of us, our print articles and what became our online articles has remained fundamentally unchanged since the 1960s. So if you were to go back in the archives of science and look at an article, how an article looked in the 60s is fundamentally kind of how an article looks today. I mean, we've gotten better typefaces and we've paid more attention to the layout, but in terms of the sections of the articles, the order in which things are presented, and therefore what we think is important to our readers hasn't changed much. And ever since the 1920s, the industry and researchers have been challenged by containers, whether it was an article or a journal issue or volumes for the content. And we can see that in some pieces of an article. So for a really long time, we've taken out important segments of an article for special communities and distribute them outside of the container of the article. And we do this a lot today with abstracts and with material and method sections and with supplementary material. So I used to work for the American Psychological Association. And way back in the 1920s, they created Psychological Abstracts, which was a print product basically cataloging the abstracts of effectively the important psychology journals at the time. And it was printed pretty much as a phone book that was sold to libraries. And that was really important because that is how a researcher could stay abreast of the literature, because then you were limited to how many journals could fit on your library stack or in your lab or on your desk, and there really wasn't a good broad way of surveying everything at once. Well, that functionally was a rudimentary abstract and indexing database. And in the 80s, we moved into electronic media. It became reel-to-reel, or it became diskettes, or it became CDs. And eventually, those became online databases. And then in 2000, we started seeing the advent of specialized services. You may have a database of just methods and protocols, which are effectively threads that are really important of an article or a study that's been pulled out to say, if you want to understand the right test or scale or measure that's used within your discipline, you can go to this specialized database rather than searching across a ton of journals or finding, say, a right edited volume or a professional book series that would tell you how to do these things. And then in around 1999, we started talking about supplementary material and appending things to the article. And some of the supplementary material is really important context or information that couldn't fit within the constraints of an article, and we've started to do all types of crazy things. But again, it was things that didn't kind of fit within the container. So the questions for me are, we've talked for a very long time about our article for the future. And we've talked a lot about print templates, and now we know those templates are no longer sufficient. We know that we're seeing, say, in digital scholarship or digital humanities, we want to incorporate more things into the article template. We want greater flexibility. We want to be able to pull things out of those flat PDFs that are a lot of our supplementary material and present that data, those tables, those figures in line with the call out in the text. And related to supplementary data, I think the first NISO working group on how we should handle supplementary data was back probably, 2000, 2002. But we haven't, as an industry, figured out how to approach it. We know more and more, particularly from, say, corporate librarians, who was able to talk to a few weeks ago, that they want that supplementary data, they want that rich context pulled into their workflow solutions. Having the article or having the article metadata isn't enough. They want the whole shebang. And then open access is creating even more pressure on articles in the container, because now we have to deal with research artifacts and primary data. And it's next to impossible to take primary data and stick it in an article container. And here's some data from science, and here's where I see our industry and our platforms and our services becoming more focused on interoperability and drawing out those threads. If I was more talented with Excel, I would have broken the scale, because what's really important here is the very, very last line, where we see figure-only views or access to supplementary material. And if we were to zoom in, you would see that views to just as our figures, which is an important encapsulation or a summary of research findings and data, is on the rise, and we're seeing an increase. When we talk to some of our members and our readers, we know that a lot of people in some disciplines are starting their lit searches by using Google Images and are coming in straight from the figures itself. And maybe that's a function of information overload. Maybe it's a function of how horrible a search and discovery experience can be. But I think it says that we have to pay more attention to the services around our containers rather than the containers themselves. And also, Science is the first journal that I've worked with that HTML usage is largely on par with PDF usage. So majority of the journals that I've worked with in my career, the PDF is used almost exponentially more than the HTML. So what is the future? I think the things that excite me the most wearing my business hat is the shift away from selling volumes or individual journal subscriptions or aggregated collections or databases or individual articles, say on a pay-per-view basis, to more transactional and licensing commerce. that less and less it isn't the research article, but it is data within the article, especially in the context of text and data mining or machine learning, that is important. And thinking beyond that, how do we operate in a world of Watson and AI, where it isn't necessarily the content that's important, but it is the relationships within our corpus, the relationships between our metadata that we now have to begin to value. So when we think about the container as a context in which our content is sold, I think the future is something very different than what it is today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Tara Cataldo. I am a librarian at the University of Florida, where I wear several hats, but a couple are I am a biological and life sciences librarian, was my subject specialty, and I'm the science collections coordinator. So I oversee the collections management in the STEM fields and wrangle 12 science librarians to make decisions on joint purchases and fun things like that. But I'm here today to talk about a little research project about containers, called Researching Students' Information Choices. It's actually not that little. It's a 3-year IMLS funded research project, and I am one of 12 researchers on the team. And we are looking at students' ability to identify containers in the digital world, and not only about the identity, but what role it plays in their judgment of its credibility. So in this quite large project, we're studying students all the way from 4th graders all the way to graduate students. It's kind of scary that many of us have experience with adult learners, but we've entered the scary K through 12 world, and it's quite interesting. What we're doing here, we have one of the big things about the project is kind of trying to design a new methodology for studying online behavior, and we're focused on the kind of the point of selection when they're beginning the search. They've got some kind of a school assignment, a research assignment, their dissertation. They're starting off the search, and where are they starting off the search? You tell me, where are they starting the search? Yeah, oh yes, Google. So we want to see that behavior when they're starting those searches off in Google. This is a challenge to do, have people come in and watch them do the research with live Google, because they can't get 2 participants to have the same experience and bring up the same results. So you can't compare apples to apples. So part of the study is to make a Google simulation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, it's a 3-year project. We're only about halfway through, and we just finished our pilot phase with the adults. And so I'm going to show you a little bit from those aspects. And let's see. So just to get funding, you have to have official research questions. We actually have hundreds and hundreds of questions, but this is kind of like what we really want to get out of it and the broader scope. We want to be able to understand this behavior of container collapse and the format agnostic student. What does it mean to be format agnostic? What can they identify? How do they identify? What cues are they using? What about their backgrounds, their own personal heuristics that may drive the way they interact with this information? Now, to answer these again, we've made this Google simulation, and it's kind of hard for me to verbally explain that for you. So one of our research team members made a video. So hopefully that is going to work here and show you what I mean, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Let's see if we get sound. One more click.
Participants begin the simulation on the welcome screen, and in the next screen they'll view a short video.
Scientists have a slithering problem on their hands. Burmese pythons are literally eating their way through the Everglades.
After the video, they are presented with their research prompt and given the Google search page to do their initial search. In the first task, the research participants are able to go through all of these search results and determine which sources they find most helpful for their project. Each of these are clickable, so they can click in and explore and then go back out. And as they're exploring, they're also going to be selecting 20 of these resources that they find most helpful and indicating they found it helpful by checking the checkbox. So we have 4 pages of results. Each of the pages looks the same. As you can see, once they have clicked in and clicked back out, the search result turns purple, just like in real Google. Okay, and when we're done here, they click submit to go to the next task. And in this task, they're going to be shown the results that they selected in the first task and asked whether or not they would cite these in their paper. And they'll select yes or no, and we will prompt them to talk about why as they do so. And we're just going to have some blank pages here because normally this would be filled with the results that they chose, but I only chose the first on the first page, those 3. So on this task, they're going to be shown the search results that they didn't select as helpful, and we're asking them to explain why they didn't find those helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and click through these, and as they're going through these and explaining why they're not helpful, of course they can still click into each one if they maybe didn't look at it on the first round or don't remember what it is. So in this task, we're again showing them the resources they selected as helpful, and they're just rating them on credibility. So just selecting one of these buttons for how credible they believe this source is and discussing why. Again, having to go through these blank pages. So we get to the end. Alright, so on this last task, for each of these sources, this is a pre-selected set of sources. It doesn't have to do with what they selected as helpful or not. They're just going to be taking the tag on the right, one of these green tags, and dragging it over and dropping it into the little box to assign which tag they find, or which container they find most appropriate for each source. And this continues throughout for several more pages. So we'll just go ahead and just to see how it works, drop a couple tags on here, and as you can see they turn to italics once they're dropped on. And you hit submit, and we get another page of the same.
Okay, so that's what we keep talking about when I say simulation. And again, we have just finished the adult pilot phase. At the end of this study, about a year from now, we're going to have 180 of these sessions to analyze. But right now, we only have 8. So I'm not going to be talking findings here, but some really interesting talking points that we saw in the pilots and that you'd find interesting, particularly in that last task about the containers. These are, again, we do have the students split into 3 cohorts in the adult group alone, because 30 of them will be from a community college, 30 will be university undergraduates, and 30 university graduate students. And so I did have a smattering of those represented in the pilot. And it's kind of maybe been hard to see in that container task. They had 8 choices there. These are a little easier to see what the 8 choices of containers were and how many resources in the adult simulation were that container type. And we've been talking a lot about, Will was mentioning how much about the article. It killed them that we didn't give them an article choice in this. It really bothered them. They couldn't say it was an article, almost as much as it bothered them that we made them go past the first page of Google results. So this is what they identified in that container task, these 8 participants only. And the first column here shows you the resource type, with the book or journal article, magazine article, where it was coming from, whether a publisher's site or a personal site. And then you have the 8 containers there and how they identified them. And you can see there was quite a bit of variety in some of those. Only 2 of the resources did all 8 students agree on, and that was a Google book was a book, and the New York Times article was news. And then all the others have some measure of disparity. The one that was obviously the most confusing here was a magazine article on the JSTOR platform. 8 students, and they gave it 5 different container names. So again, not findings, but just really interesting. And not surprising, I guess, those 2 that they got right, we know we could easily hypothesize that the brand recognition, name recognition is going to play a role here. And if the pilot's any indication, that's going to totally play out, and we'll be very interested to see how it plays out. But these are just a few of the comments. Again, as you can see in the simulation, they mentioned that they're going to be talking to us the whole time. We're using a think aloud protocol. They've got to be telling us, what are you thinking? Why are you clicking on that? Why aren't you clicking on this? And I just pulled out a few things related to brand here that I thought was interesting. We had a graduate student who every time he saw something from Springer was just, thank God for Springer. But then the community college student saw, one link went, and let me see if I can get the inflection right, it was link.springer.com. Never heard of it, and she didn't click on it, moved right along to another result. And then Wiley was a 9, but I would say 3 out of the 8 thought Wiley and thought textbook. Their textbooks were with it. Even when they were looking at a Wiley journal article, they immediately thought it was a book until they saw other cues there. But not such a bad thing. They gave it a pretty good trustworthiness in that recognition. In addition to the Think Aloud protocol and the simulation of just capturing this data, we interview them as well. And one of the questions we ask at the end is about the container. Does it matter that what type of container that information is coming from? And all of the 8 pilot students said yes. And these are some of their comments as why they said that it mattered to know what the container was. There was some self-recognition that it is hard to differentiate. They're very hard on blogs. Sorry, scholarly kitchen chefs, but they really were almost as hard as they were on news. They were pretty hard on news. It was really interesting. Just these 8 are so interesting. We can't wait to have the full run. A few areas, we think the result of this could be impactful in so many different areas for teachers and librarians like me who do teaching and what do they teach. I was very heartened in this that they are all seem to have been listening to their teachers, and they would talk about, my teacher said this, and they talked a lot about the .edus versus .coms and all that, and I was like, oh, they're listening, and oh, we're not telling them the right things, or we're not telling them consistently and evolving as the digital information evolves. We think it has aspects in terms of research and the dissemination of our things, citation styles. We hope the container collapse issue or where we move forward may make that a little simpler since it's very tied to print. In terms of, on one of my hats being in collections of the libraries, these guys are asking me, where does it lead into what, the decisions we make in the collections and what we might choose and what containers that it is in. And my answer to that is it's going to be driven by these students that we're studying and the way they see it and the importance that they give it. In the same way that the researchers now, went to I need it now on-site demand, or it's not worthless, and so that's changed a lot, a lot of our collection practices to, just in time instead of possibly something that'll be useful in the future. And I think these guys and the students and the way that they look at this, having grown up with the internet, is going to drive all our future decisions. I will say in all the discussions, we talk about silos and Aave and other sessions where getting rid of the silos, that's definitely in the right direction. If container collapse is a problem, siloing is definitely not the answer. And then, of course, we're all designing and putting out digital information, even us in the libraries and in our institutional repository, and putting, born digital items that we are creating, the design of that and what it means. And again, if it's important for your users to be able to identify the container and what it tells them, then we might have to be looking at the cues that they need and be able to do that. And so if you want to follow our project and where we're going, again, it's a 3-year, and then that just kind of ends one part. I'm sure the data collecting will be swimming in data and analyzing our 180 simulation sessions. If you want to follow how that goes, and contact us. The whole team is on this website, and my contact information, and follow us on Twitter and all those fun things. Okay.
So do we have any questions from the audience at this point? Yeah, go ahead. If you go to a mic, we've got virtual users that will be able to hear.
Hi, I'm Kim Martin with SAE International, and we have multiple platforms as well. So I wanted to ask you, you were saying not everything was available to be found. Do you find that to be a problem? And even what you're leaning towards in the future, is everything going to be discoverable from one place? And do you see that as a problem? Why or why not?
That is the intention, to make everything discoverable from one entry point. We are aware, of course, that a lot of our usage comes from outside the platforms, and that's good. We don't complain about it. We are aware that the regular use case is to jump in, get the PDF, and jump out. But we want to encourage people to explore more of our content if they have a research subject where they see that Brill is really an important publisher. And in that respect, yes, it is in our interest to make all the resources discoverable from one point, and that would be the main platform. That's not going to be the case at the first instance yet, but that is sort of going forward the intention. You also asked something about availability at the beginning, and that I didn't fully understand. That you said everything should be available.
Well, I think what I was talking about was, you were saying a dictionary was in the encyclopedia part or something like that. So how will someone find it?
They will just find stuff. That's what they tell us that they want to do. But then they see all the findings presented in one result place with a clear mark of what they are looking at. So we are making it easier than Google. And then, we also indicate whether this is something that they are subscribed to or not. And then we encourage them to go there. And they won't even notice on that result screen that when they click on it, they actually end up on another platform. Well, they will notice something will pop up, but basically they feel that's the intention still, that they're remaining in the same environment and that they're not sort of leaving and all over the place.
Thank you very much for nice talks. Ove, one question for you. In terms of making it discoverable, how big is the problem of data normalization across all these various sources and data standardization? And at the back end, what are you planning to do to make sure that it is the disambiguation and everything else happens? How are you tackling that?
so that we can find a dictionary next to a journal article. Is that?
Or a book chapter with the same author, with the journal article with the same author. And or you search by an institute and you find everything from of the institute in one thing. Maybe a book chapter, maybe a journal article, maybe an entry in the dictionary, whatever. So how do we ensure that normalization? Because people, once we keep everything on one platform, people also expect that from a user perspective.
Yeah, so are you talking about things like labeling the article with a unique institutional identifier? So if I look at output from researchers of Harvard University, that I receive all of that in the results screen? Yeah. Well, that's a very good question, and certainly one that touches upon user cases that we are aware of. It's more a question about the content than about the containers. And we are talking about content, so it's a good place. But what we are doing with this platform revamp is mainly to address the way how the containers are being presented next to each other. If we wanted to address the need that you just described, and we certainly would like to, we would need to get deeper into the content, and that's something that we will look into in the future. We are, of course, working with ORCIDs, but not yet to the extent that it would allow things that you're describing here. So that's sort of a next project once we have the bigger framework in place.
So how useful is the, so I'm thinking in terms of containers and then navigation. So say like a table of contents approach in the book realm. You mentioned a little bit about alphabetization of like dictionaries and things like that, but does this sort of reworking of containers, taking things out of context, make it a little more difficult for people to find what they're looking for or understand the context of what they're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the kind of books you're dealing with. Some books really lend themselves to being sort of disaggregated, right? Because there's not a lot of relationship between the entries within the book. But if you've got a book with a strong narrative structure, then the TSC is an important sort of artifact that allows the user to know where they are within the book. So it can be an important sort of framing device to you know, give them context. And that's what I was sort of, one of the things I was talking about is I think it's really important when you've got those kinds of books online to provide as much of that as possible, because it's really easy to lose that kind of context with ebooks.
And in terms of the distribution of the books that we have, a colleague of mine did some good calculations here, and we found that I think about 45% of the books, only 45% or as much as 45% were monographs, where a table of content are important. They're usually by one author in the humanities, and they really present one train of thought where the chapters are closely related. But that means that the other part of the book spectrum that we publish are of different kinds. So another 45% is actually edited volumes of invited chapters. Well, they also are related to one theme in a book, but they are less closely related. They are usually written by different authors. And then we have these 10% of special books, encyclopedia, etc., which are a completely different kind, although we call them books. We like books.
Hi, I'm Jean McIntyre with the American Academy of Otolaryngology, head and neck surgery, ear, nose, and throat physicians. And this is a little bit different than a journal problem, although I deal with journals all the time. We also publish patient information, and lately we've discovered that Google had changed their criteria for how content is listed, and whereas we were hoping to be among the top entries in the list on certain topics, That has now changed because Google's partnering with another medical institution, and they have determined that the criteria will now be how often the information is refreshed. So now that that is a player in discoverability, does that play into people's choice of what they find as a reference? I'm wondering, does anybody have experience with these kinds of issues in discoverability and content packages and how they're discoverable?
So
it's a big question, but it's frightening in many ways.
So I think as publishers, we wake up on a daily basis realizing that we're subject to the whims of other platforms. And how our content is discovered and used depends on Google and its algorithms. Or if you publish news content like Science does, what Facebook may decide to do with it. But I think there's a very important distinction between the container and the metadata around the container.
Right.
And making sure your metadata is structured right and understanding, we're realizing we have to have a core competency around Google. And that things like whether or not your page is responsive, how big your header is, the amount of text that is exposed on a first page view is going to matter a lot in their black box number crunching that I swear nobody understands. But it is important, but I think it's more about the metadata than the container itself.
So what I think you're telling me is that the user experience and the context in the study that Florida is doing, if you can identify that context in the URL, for instance, it will be more attractive.
Yeah, but it sounds like if you have identified that the frequency of update is an important signal for you to be visible in Google, I mean, I think that whether you like it or not, that becomes a constraint on how you run your business. Or I mean, you really have to respond to that because we all know that how despite your users, how unwilling people are to go beyond the first page.
Yes, just a concern.
Yeah.
I have an experience as a researcher. I have a Google Scholar profile, and my article is all listed there. And I love the thing that before I've even it's been published, and I haven't gotten around to adding it. But Google's like, "Hey, is this you? Click here," and it shows up. I'm like, "Oh, great!" I went to go look for an article to grab the URL just the other day, a preview to this study, and I clicked on it from my Google Scholar profile, and I know when I originally did it, it took me straight to the publisher's page where the article was, and it took me instead to ProQuest into the aggregator, and I was just like, I know. And then I was like, didn't my ProQuest rep recently, I know they've been working with Google, I think they worked something out, but they gave me the link, I gave up doing that. I can create, I can delete that and then add my own entry back to the other one, but it was like, oh, that's really interesting, though, that they changed the pathway.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let's see, I have a question. Olivia and Will, could you sort of go into a little bit more detail? How do you see the open access sort of affecting the way container usage is used on your sites, and is there an effect? Especially like Will, you were talking about the future being sort of content licensing and things, and in the OA world, what does that mean?
So I think there's been a few effects already on our container and our metadata. So one is we had to change our XML to suddenly accommodate new licensing data or more information about the article and how it could be reused. So that, if you've worked in a production environment before, that means you suddenly have to go all the way back up to your manuscript submission systems and start changing essentially your metadata collection and distribution from there, which is always a fun project to do. But one of the things that I think we will struggle to support in the future is part of the open access movement is not just being able to access the article and being able to reuse it, but it is also having access to the underlying data. And there's kind of varying degrees of success among publishers and industries, but I think that places an emphasis on, say, linking to preprint versions of the article, connecting from the article itself to the study design, if it was registered, or the protocol in another database, but most importantly, to the underlying data, which may be on your site in supplementary data. It might be in Dryad or Dataverse, or it could be somewhere else. And if you think about publishers and how we approached our own platform, 5-6 years ago, we would have said, we don't want anybody to leave ever, and now we're getting kind of this imperative and drive from our authors and our researchers and our members to say, oh no, you should easily link us elsewhere. So I think it's a fundamental shift in what we want to link to from our containers and how we are displaying those containers on our platform.
To go a little bit back further, I mean, the whole idea of open access of sponsored articles, of articles that are paid by the authors or by their funders is obviously an effect of the digital age. So the decomposition of journals into articles that are also saleable, turned out to be saleable not just to users but also to their authors. So that is maybe the first thing that has impact on the form of the container. But then also on the macro level, we in Europe are seeing deals happening between a whole country, the legislation or education system of a country, with the universities in that country, with big publishers that they say, well, if you make this big one license with us and our researchers can access all the content, you are able to publish a lot with us open access without having to pay extra fees. So to link basically the open access license with the reader license. And that is the pressure on the journals, because this is just becoming a big deal in a different context, which also has impact on the traditional containers. But I come back to my belief that both models, the single article and the sort of the bundle deal changes, which are possible and which we embrace, which are positive developments, that they both lend their credibility from the artifact of the journal in this case.
Sorry, I realized I don't want to pay short shrift to something, but that is inherent in OA is the ability for machine-readable content and text and data mining, which I think is a huge shift in technical requirements for a publishing platform, the container themselves and how the content is used. And I think that's a sea change from, hey, I'll sell you an annual journal subscription, or here's an online table of contents in the 13 articles we just published this week.
If we don't have any others from the audience.
We have a question from the virtual audience.
Oh, good.
Okay, so the question is, when increasing discoverability of every single content in possible container, is possible indexing used?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat the question.
Okay.
When increasing discoverability of every single content in possible container, is possible indexing useful?
Oh, is possible indexing useful? Oh. Does anybody want to take a crack at this one?
I mean, so to a certain extent, we know that indexing is happening in Google, right? Because that's what we see in our usage. At the same time, we do provide what we think is better indexing within the platform, because we know the content really well and we can provide a really, an even better search experience based on the particulars of the content within the platform. And it's definitely true that as the amount of content increases, finding the content successfully is the metadata and the enrichment of the content so that people can in fact find it becomes increasingly important.
So I guess Yes, I think abstracting and indexing remains important, and I think it's more important that publishers understand the various audiences they're serving. So one of the things ANI services do really well is help researchers combat information overload. So that if I am a biomedical researcher, I know that I can go to Medline and I can quickly find peer review research. I know that if I am performing a search in PsycInfo, I am primarily searching peer-reviewed literature, so everything in that database has passed some sniff test around credibility or reliability. And for specialized researchers or research communities, I think ANI services are going to continue to play an important role. But are they going to be the massive scale plays of every web entrepreneur's dreams? Probably not.
But I do think there's an interesting aspect to alerting services and social networks in that realm as providing a way through the sort of morass of content. And it would be interesting to see how the degree to which alerting services grow and expand and become powerful enough that researchers can really use them with some fair amount of belief that they'll really collate and surface all of the content that they're really interested in. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I have some more. Oh, absolutely. We yes, of course. Sorry.
So it'll be for three of you in terms of open access, and I'd be thinking about that in the container. It followed the traditional containers, those open access journals and open access books. But it had me wondering, open educational resources, where I see those that crop up and I look at it, is it a textbook? Is it a website? There's a whole combination of things. Are they able to blur the lines of container and open educational resources a little easier because they do not have to the pressure of having to put a valuation on it?
I'm going to pass because that one's well outside my area of expertise.
We also, as Wil, we have a lot of stuff, but we don't have textbooks really. It's not one of our core domains. But I do see the point that this is a different animal. It's also in our space, of course. It's not a news item, but it is something that follows maybe different rules.
Do we have a textbook publisher in the room who's brave enough to stand up? That would be great.
It's interesting because occasionally the content in our platforms does get used and pulled into educational resources, but that doesn't typically then become a discoverability layer. So the students are led to that through the courses they're taking or whatever, but it doesn't sort of have so the open access component of that is sort of becomes not. So, Tara, in the work, it's really interesting, the leading indicators. To what extent are you teaching students now, the sort of tools for understanding containers and context and the signals, and how do you see this changing as the data from this survey, this project starts unfolding?
We're hoping to change it kind of more systematically because we really haven't been. You've just kind of made assumptions, and we're focused, more on you're in here, and we're going to teach you how to use this database and that kind of thing, and not really going with the container. But definitely, since we've started this research, we're thinking about it more and more, and what's the way to get that. And we want to work with ACRL on their standards for information literacy. But one of the reasons that we went back into our OCLC researchers, when we first talked about it, have a project that relates to this called Digital Visitors and Residents. And they started with high schoolers. And right away at the beginning of our project, they're like, we need to go earlier. And because we're trying to figure out where the behavior starts, again, with that flatness online and where we need to do it. And again, seeing these pilot adults still saying, oh, it has to be a .edu or .gov. And some of them said, oh, I learned that in elementary school, which was like, oh. Has no one said anything else since like a one-shot session you have with a media specialist in elementary school? We were definitely thinking about it. We don't know the answers yet.
As a publisher, I was both fascinated and terrified about how our brand really didn't convey. I mean, that you think about how much we care about the name of our houses, and we plaster it on our journals and all over our websites and on just about everything. And as a signifier of credible or reputable content, we were in trouble.
For Wil and Ave, to what extent have the sort of institutional infrastructure issues, the publishing houses grew up in, to support, the internal infrastructure grew up to support the various print containers, and to what extent have you had to fight against that as you sort of developed your online products? Have you had to work around those barriers in creating the sort of new online products, or has that not been an issue? I know for some of our publishers, they haven't been able to do some of those things because internally they can't deal with it, or externally their salespeople don't know how to sell it. Have those turned, have you had those kinds of issues?
So the transition from
Yeah, so in developing sort of new models or new collections of content, new ways of selling, have you been stymied at all in your efforts to do that based on the internal structures?
Yeah, I mean, I can give an example from a very different area. We are only talking about online containers, but as I mentioned, we still have print containers, print books, a lot of them. And we used to ship our PUD books from Europe to America because we had this very, very good PUD plan, print-on-demand plan in Europe. We want to have zero inventory, so we go for a PUD, but we have a very strange PUD that we produce our PUD books in Europe on demand and then ship them to the United States because we didn't find a printer that met our expectations of what our books should look like. And we assumed also our readers' expectations. Well, I think we were wrong with that. We, well, if I may say so, in the United States, realized that the fact that the books that are produced here are of different quality has not to do with the lack of technology, but with other priorities. So I'm just talking about the round back, for instance, that how things look nicely. In Europe, this is very, very common. Here it is less common, and it's more acceptable that books look less classy. Sorry, because it's about the content. And in the end, our buyers are institutional. 90% of our books are sold by libraries, and to libraries. It's, in our case at least, it's not the end consumer market where you have to convince people also in the bookshop. So we were very happy that we did find a high quality PUD printer in the US that met our needs, and that we now, and that is the important thing, get our books much quicker to the reader. But who is complaining? The editors, because they still love the container, the physical container books that had this structure and this smell, and now it's a bit different. And when we tell them that your readers, the readers of your book, had to wait 3 weeks sometimes to get this book, and orders were canceled all the time, they don't seem to care sometimes. It's not arguments that convince them. They are being told that this is the reason why we did it. We don't openly tell them that we also saved a lot of cost by changing this. But it's really the time issue, to be closer to market, to serve our readers better, to increase readership, and they are still stuck to the physical print book. And that's lovely. I mean, they are lovely people, but this is definitely a challenge to overcome that.
So I think as a house that just publishes journals, I think we went through a lot of the print to digital container pain. Some colleagues from production are in here, I want to say a decade ago, but I'm sure it was only 5-6 years ago. But where we are challenged now is really how to value and sell the container. So it's easy enough for us to sell an annual subscription. It's easy enough for us to figure out how to price a collection of content or a topical collection or an individual article or a news story. But when it gets to text and data mining and licensing our content or metadata, that's a much more abstract thing. So for a artificial intelligence repository, something like Watson, how do we now price what are the valuable threads of our content that they use, or the connections that they're building from our corpus? And I think that's what we our biggest struggle in this post-container, just give us the really good nugget economy that we're headed into, is it's really hard for us to put a price sticker on it.
So if there aren't any more questions from the audience, I think we'll let you go. But a big round of applause for our great panelists.